You can't enter. Black twin daughters guard their mum's hospital bed. What the CEO father sees next breaks him. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr. Peter's family. May the Almighty shower every woman with a light that never fades, a strength that holds entire generations together, and a peace that settles gently in her heart. Women are the quiet miracles of this world, lifting others while hiding their own pain, giving love even when their own hands are empty, and standing tall with a grace no storm can destroy. I pray every woman receives honor in her home, comfort in her soul, and blessings that pour into her life like endless rain. May every burden be lifted from her shoulders, every silent tear be replaced with joy, and every step she takes be protected and guided. A woman's worth is priceless. May the world finally treat her that way. If your heart respects women like the video, if your soul values them right, I stand with respect. Bert Arthur stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, master of an empire built on the ashes of his greatest mistake, watching the city lights blur into the ghost of a woman who haunted him every single night for years beyond counting. The whiskey in his hand had gone warm an hour ago, but he held it anyway because letting go meant admitting another day had passed without finding her, without making it right, without the chance to fall on his knees and beg forgiveness for the unforgivable. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger wearing his expensive suit, a hollow man playing the role of success while rotting from the inside out. His assistant's voice came through the intercom, breaking the silence that had become his constant companion. The words she spoke made the glass slip from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor in an explosion that matched the destruction happening inside his chest. Gloria Goodman had been admitted to City General Hospital, critical condition. The name he'd whispered into darkness for years suddenly attached to a location, a reality, a chance he'd stopped believing would ever come. Bert grabbed his keys without bothering to tell anyone where he was going, taking the stairs instead of the elevator because waiting felt impossible when he'd already waited lifetimes. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of red lights he barely saw, and traffic laws that meant nothing compared to the thundering need to reach her, to see her face, to finally say everything he'd been rehearsing in his head since the morning she walked out of his life, carrying the future he'd been too terrified to claim. His mind dragged him backward as he drove, pulling him into memories that had worn grooves into his soul from constant repetition. Gloria at that charity gala, handling a crisis with grace and humor while everyone else panicked, her laughter cutting through his grief over his father's death and making him feel human again for the first time in months. Gloria, in his penthouse, after they'd stopped pretending they could resist each other, her head on his chest while she traced patterns on his skin and told him about her dreams of running her own business, of creating beautiful moments for other people, of building something meaningful with her own hands. Gloria's face when she told him about the pregnancy, hope and fear mixing in her expression as she waited for him to say something, anything, everything that mattered. He'd given her silence, then panic. Then the cruelest words he'd ever spoken, dressed up as practicality and necessity and all the lies cowards tell themselves when they choose fear over love. She'd looked at him with devastation that carved itself into his memory with such precision that he could still see every detail of her breaking, and then she'd gathered what remained of her dignity and walked away from him forever. Bert parked in the emergency zone and ran toward the hospital entrance, his heart hammering against his ribs with enough force to crack bone. He found her floor through sheer determination and the kind of commanding presence that came from years of making people bend to his will. But when he reached the right corridor and turned toward her room, he stopped so abruptly that his shoes squeaked against the polished floor. Two girls stood in front of Gloria's door like guards protecting something sacred. They were tall and poised, dressed in clothes that spoke of careful budgeting stretched to look presentable, and their faces held features he recognized from his own mirror, mixed with Gloria's beauty in a combination so perfect it stole the breath from his lungs. His daughters. The children he'd rejected stood between him and their mother, and the hatred in their eyes burned hotter than anything he'd faced in boardrooms full of enemies. The taller one stepped forward first, her shoulders squared and her chin lifted in a gesture of defiance that reminded him painfully of himself. She looked at him with assessment cold enough to freeze oceans, taking in his expensive suit and his desperate expression with equal contempt. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of controlled fury that came from years of practice holding back volcanic rage. Our mother said if Bert Arthur ever came near her, we should tell him exactly what she told us to say. She paused, letting him feel the weight of his name in her mouth, like a curse. You had your chance to be a father. You chose your empire, now stay away from ours. The words hit him like physical blows, each one landing with precision on wounds that had never healed. Bert stared at his daughters and saw everything he'd lost reflected back at him in high definition, every moment he'd missed crystallized in their posture and their pain and their absolute rejection of his existence. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to beg, but the second daughter moved to stand beside her sister, presenting a united front that declared war on his very presence. "We know who you are," she said, and her voice carried fire where her sisters held ice. "We know what you did to her. We know what you said when she told you about us. And we know you don't deserve to breathe the same air as the woman who sacrificed everything to give us the life you were too weak to provide. So turn around and go back to your empire, because that's the only thing you chose to build, and it's the only thing you're allowed to keep." Bert took a step forward anyway, driven by desperation stronger than pride, but hospital security appeared as if summoned by his daughter's will alone. The taller girl produced documentation with the efficiency of someone who'd prepared for this exact confrontation. Papers that proved Gloria had explicitly excluded him from any medical decisions or visitation rights. His name was listed in legal language as someone to be barred from her care, from her presence, from any voice in what happened to her now. "You can't keep me from her," Bert said, and his voice cracked on words he'd never imagined having to speak. "I have rights. I'm her—" "You're nothing," the daughter with fire interrupted. "You were nothing when she needed you, and you're nothing now. The only difference is that now you have to live with knowing exactly what you threw away, and you have to live with it from the other side of this door where you belong." Security escorted him toward the elevator, while his daughters watched with satisfaction that looked too adult for faces so young. Bert tried to memorize their features, tried to find himself in the curve of their jaws and the set of their shoulders, tried to understand how he'd created something so magnificent and lost the chance to know them in the same breath of cosmic injustice. As the elevator doors started to close, the daughter with ice in her voice called out to him one last time. "She never told us why she left you, never spoke badly about you once, just said you weren't ready to be what we needed. But I found her journals. I know what you said to her when she told you about us. I know you told her to get rid of us. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to feel what she felt. You're going to stand on the other side of that door and wonder if the person you love is dying, and you're going to be completely powerless to stop it, just like she was powerless when you broke her." The elevator descended, taking Bert away from the family he'd destroyed before it ever had the chance to exist, and the reflection in the polished doors showed him exactly what he'd become. A man who built empires on graves of his own making, a father rejected by daughters who had every right to hate him, a fool who'd spent years searching for a woman who'd been raising his children to be strong enough to survive without him while he'd been building monuments to his own guilt and calling it success. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Refuses Him. Bert returned to the hospital at dawn after a sleepless night, but this time he came without lawyers or assistants, carrying only coffee and the weight of 15 years of regret that had calcified into something harder than bone. His daughters were still there, looking like they'd taken shifts through the darkness, and when they saw him approaching, they moved to block his path with the same determination they'd shown the night before. But something had shifted in the hours between confrontations, some barely perceptible softening in their stance that suggested exhaustion might be eroding the edges of their absolute hatred. "She's awake," the one with ice in her voice said, and Bert realized he didn't even know his daughter's names yet. She knows you're here. She told us herself that if you came back, we should let you stand at her door, not enter, not speak to her directly, just stand there so she can see you and decide what she wants. The qualification felt like both gift and punishment, permission to be present but not participate, to exist in Gloria's peripheral vision while she determined whether his existence had any value beyond the cautionary tale she'd apparently used to teach their daughters about the unreliability of men who made promises they couldn't keep. They led him to her room, and through the window he could see her sitting up in the hospital bed, thinner and frailer than his memories had painted her, but undeniably awake and conscious, and looking directly at him with eyes that held everything he'd been terrified to face for 15 years. She wasn't unconscious or medicated into oblivion. She was there, fully present, studying him with the kind of assessment that suggested she was cataloguing every change the years had carved into his face, while he did the same to hers. Gloria's hair had silver threading through the dark. Her skin held lines that spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure, and the hospital gown couldn't hide how illness had stolen the softness from her body and replaced it with angles too sharp for comfort. But her eyes were the same, that particular shade of brown that looked almost gold in certain light, and they held intelligence and pain and something that might have been longing before pride buried it beneath protective ice. She gestured for his daughters to open the door, and when they did, she spoke for the first time, her voice rougher than he remembered, but still unmistakably hers. "You can stand in the doorway, not one step further. I want to hear you explain why you're here after all this time, what you think showing up at my deathbed will accomplish, why you believe you deserve to disrupt the peace I've spent 15 years building." The words were delivered without venom, just flat honesty that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. Bert stood in the doorway as instructed, aware of his daughters flanking him like guards ready to remove him at their mother's slightest indication of distress, and tried to find words adequate to the moment. "I searched for you," he said, because it was the only truth that mattered. "Every day since you left. Hired investigators, checked databases, followed leads that went nowhere because you disappeared so completely. I started to think I'd imagined our entire relationship. I needed to find you, to apologize, to tell you that leaving you was the worst mistake of my life, and I've spent every moment since trying to figure out how to fix what I broke." Gloria's expression didn't change, didn't soften or harden, just remained fixed in that careful neutrality that suggested she'd expected exactly these words and had already decided they weren't enough. "You searched for 15 years, but apparently not hard enough because I wasn't hiding. I changed my name legally, yes, but I stayed in this country, built a business, raised our daughters in places that had public records and paper trails. If you'd really wanted to find me, you would have. The truth is, you searched hard enough to ease your guilt, but not hard enough to actually succeed, because succeeding meant facing consequences you weren't ready to handle." The accusation landed with surgical precision, cutting through his carefully constructed narrative about being the devoted seeker who'd been thwarted by Gloria's exceptional ability to disappear. She was right. He'd hired investigators, but accepted their failures too easily, had told himself he'd done everything possible, while knowing somewhere deep down that finding her would mean admitting the full extent of his cowardice in ways that were easier to avoid. "I named them Iris and Jade," Gloria continued, and her voice held steel beneath the roughness, "after flowers that bloom in adversity. I wanted them to know from birth that beauty doesn't require perfect conditions, that strength comes from surviving harsh circumstances, that they were wanted and loved even if their father couldn't see their worth. They're brilliant and kind and everything you would have been proud of if you'd bothered to stick around and watch them become who they are." Bert felt tears burning behind his eyes, but refused to let them fall, because crying felt like asking for sympathy he hadn't earned. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, needing to know the medical reality even if the answer destroyed him. "How bad is it?" Stage 4 cervical cancer, Gloria said with the casual tone of someone who'd made peace with her own mortality. Metastasized to multiple organs. I have weeks, maybe days. It was treatable years ago when I first discovered it, but I couldn't afford the intervention, and by the time I could afford it, the window had closed. So now I'm dying, and you showed up just in time to watch me go, which feels appropriately ironic given that you weren't there for any of the actually important moments. The information hit him like artillery fire, each word landing on parts of him that still functioned as human and tearing them apart. If you'd called me when you found out, I would have paid for everything. The best doctors, experimental treatments, anything that might have saved you. Why didn't you ask? Gloria's laugh was bitter enough to curdle milk. Because you made it very clear when I was pregnant that complications weren't your problem to solve. Because I spent our daughter's entire childhood teaching them that their worth wasn't tied to your money or validation. Because asking you for help would have meant admitting I couldn't handle everything alone, and I'd rather die with my dignity intact than live knowing I'd begged the man who rejected my children to save me out of guilt instead of actual care. Her daughters stood silent, watching their mother eviscerate their father with truth that cut deeper than any anger could have managed. Bert absorbed the impact without defending himself because there was no defense for the truth. No argument that could make his cowardice look like anything other than what it was. There was a clinical trial, one of his daughters said, and Bert realized it was the one with fire in her voice speaking. 8 months ago, experimental immunotherapy specifically for Mom's cancer profile. She qualified. The doctor said it might have extended her life significantly, maybe even achieved remission. She said no, because the trial required her to relocate for 6 months, and she wasn't going to disrupt our senior year of high school by moving or leaving us behind. She chose to die so we could graduate with our friends and have normal college application experiences. The revelation made the room tilt sideways, made Bert understand that Gloria's martyrdom wasn't just about refusing his help, but about a pattern of self-sacrifice so ingrained she couldn't recognize it as slowly killing her. She'd spent years putting everyone else's needs above her own survival, convinced that being strong meant never asking for support, teaching their daughters by example that women had to be invincible because depending on others meant weakness. That's not strength, Bert said, and his voice shook with emotion he couldn't contain anymore. That's self-destruction dressed up as nobility. You're not teaching our daughters resilience, you're teaching them that their lives matter more than yours, that mothers are disposable support systems instead of whole people who deserve to be fought for and protected and given the chance to be weak sometimes without losing value. Gloria's eyes flashed with something that might have been fury before control reasserted itself. Don't you dare come into my hospital room after 15 years of absence and lecture me about how to raise our daughters. I did what I had to do to survive, to give them stability and security and everything you weren't there to provide. I made every choice alone because you weren't there to help make them, and second-guessing those choices now accomplishes nothing except making you feel better about your own failures. You're right, Bert admitted, because arguing would just be another form of the cowardice that had defined their entire relationship. I failed you catastrophically and I can't undo any of it, but I need you to know something before you die, need you to understand one truth that matters more than my failures. You were never the problem, you were always enough, more than enough. The fact that I couldn't see it doesn't diminish your worth, it just proves I was too broken to recognize what I had when I had it. Gloria stared at him for a long moment, and something in her expression cracked just enough to show the pain she'd been hiding beneath protective ice. Get out, she said quietly. Come back tomorrow if you want, or don't. But right now I need you to leave because I can't process this and maintain the composure that's keeping me from falling apart in front of our daughters, and I refuse to let them see me weak. Bert nodded and stepped back from the doorway, understanding that even this small access to her presence was a gift he didn't deserve and shouldn't squander by pushing for more before she was ready. As he walked away, he heard Gloria's voice one more time, softer now but still audible in the quiet corridor. Iris, Jade, those are their names. Learn them. Because if you come back tomorrow, I expect you to at least know who you're fighting for. Chapter 3. The Slow Work of Truth. 3 weeks passed before Bert learned anything substantive about Gloria's life during the years they'd been apart, and every piece of information came through obstacles that reminded him money couldn't actually buy everything despite his lifetime of believing otherwise. He'd returned to the hospital every morning for those 3 weeks, standing in Gloria's doorway while she decided whether to speak to him or send him away, building a fragile routine of presence that felt both pathetic and essential. Some days she talked, asking him questions about his life that felt like tests he couldn't quite pass. Other days, she just stared at him with exhaustion that went beyond physical illness, clearly trying to reconcile the man standing before her with the ghost she'd been carrying for 15 years. Iris and Jade maintained their guard but softened incrementally, accepting coffee he brought them and occasionally answering basic questions about their lives with the careful precision of people who didn't trust him but were too tired to maintain absolute hostility every moment of every day. He learned that Iris was headed to law school, that Jade had been accepted to art programs across the country, that both of them were terrified of losing their mother before knowing what adult life felt like with her still in it. But deeper information remained elusive. Bert tried to access Gloria's medical records through official channels and hit immediate walls of privacy laws and hospital bureaucracy that his money couldn't breach. He hired a lawyer who explained that without Gloria's explicit consent or a court order he'd never get, those records were sealed tighter than classified government documents. The lawyer suggested waiting, being patient, earning trust instead of trying to force access through legal manipulation. The investigator he'd kept on retainer for years finally produced Gloria's address history, but it took 2 weeks of checking county records and cross-referencing utility payments and piecing together paper trails that Gloria hadn't actually been trying to hide so much as hadn't considered worth making obvious. The trail showed her journey from the East Coast to a women's shelter, then to a series of increasingly better apartments as her event planning business grew, finally to a small house she'd purchased outright once success allowed actual stability instead of just survival. Bert drove past that house one evening, parked across the street and stared at the modest structure that represented everything Gloria had built without him. The lawn was carefully maintained, flowers planted in beds that showed someone's consistent attention, a basketball hoop in the driveway that spoke of his daughters growing up here, learning to shoot baskets after finishing homework. Neighbors walked dogs and waved to each other with the familiarity of community that developed over years of living alongside the same people, and Bert realized Gloria had given their daughters something he'd never had despite his wealth, actual roots that meant knowing the names of the people who lived next door. He contacted Gloria's event planning business through official channels, requesting information about her professional background with the flimsy excuse of considering her for a corporate contract he had no intention of actually pursuing. Her business partner, a woman who'd apparently worked with Gloria for the past decade, saw through his transparent motivation immediately and told him in no uncertain terms that she knew exactly who he was and would provide zero information about Gloria's personal or professional life without explicit permission from the woman herself. She built this company from nothing, the business partner said during their tense phone call. Worked herself to exhaustion creating beauty for strangers while sacrificing her own comfort for her daughters. And she did all of that alone because someone she trusted failed her catastrophically. So no, I'm not going to help you feel better about your guilt by giving you information she hasn't chosen to share herself. If you want to know about Gloria's life, ask her, and accept whatever answer she gives you, including silence. The conversation ended with Bert sitting in his car outside Gloria's business office, understanding that the world she'd built had protective walls he couldn't breach through force or money, or the kind of commanding presence that usually made people comply with his demands. She'd created a life that didn't need him, surrounded herself with people loyal enough to guard her privacy, even from the father of her children, proven that success didn't require his money or validation or participation in any form. He tried tracking down Gloria's friends through social media and public records, hoping someone who'd known her during the years they were apart might be willing to talk about the woman she'd become after leaving him. But Gloria's online presence was minimal, carefully curated to show only her business accomplishments and occasional photos of the twins at various ages, nothing personal enough to give him insight into her emotional life or the relationships that had sustained her through hardship. The few friends he managed to identify through patient searching either didn't respond to his attempts at contact or told him variations of the same message. Gloria's privacy was hers to control, and they weren't interested in helping him assuage guilt that should probably just eat at him for the rest of his life as natural consequence of his choices. One woman was more blunt, telling him that Gloria had cried on the anniversary of their meeting every year until the cancer diagnosis, that she'd dated men who would have made excellent stepfathers but couldn't commit because she was still hung up on someone who'd never deserved her loyalty, that she'd built an amazing life while carrying the weight of unresolved love that never had the chance to become what it should have been. "She kept a photo of you," the friend admitted reluctantly when Bert pressed for anything concrete he could hold on to. "Hidden in her jewelry box where the girls wouldn't find it. Just one picture from your time together. But she'd kept it all those years. I saw it once when helping her pack to move into the house she bought. She touched it like it hurt and healed her at the same time, like loving you was something she couldn't stop even though it destroyed pieces of her that never healed properly. That's what you did to her. You made it impossible for her to move on, and now she's dying without ever knowing what it felt like to be loved by someone brave enough to actually choose her." Bert spent that night in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling, processing information that came too slowly and cost too much emotional labor to extract from people who rightfully saw him as the villain in Gloria's story. There were no convenient plot devices delivering him instant understanding. No magical security teams producing sealed records on command, just the slow accumulation of fragments that painted a picture of the woman Gloria had become during the years he'd been building monuments to his guilt while she'd been actually living. The hospital cafeteria became his default location between morning visits to Gloria's doorway, and it was there that one of her nurses approached him during a particularly quiet afternoon. She looked exhausted, the kind of tired that came from too many shifts caring for too many dying patients with insufficient resources to make any of them comfortable. "You're the father," she said, sitting down without asking permission. "Gloria's mentioned you. Not by name, just references to someone she's been apologizing to in her sleep since admission. The cancer's progressed faster than we expected. The pain management is becoming complicated. She's refusing stronger medications because she wants to stay lucid for her daughters, but that means she's suffering more than necessary. I thought you should know since you're here every day anyway." The information felt like both gift and punishment. Concrete details about Gloria's condition delivered without the barriers that had blocked every other attempt at gathering information. Bert thanked the nurse and asked what he could do to help, expecting the usual nothing response he'd been getting for weeks. Instead, she told him about Gloria's hospital bills, about insurance maximums that had been reached, about the reality that dying was expensive, and Gloria's business success hadn't translated into wealth sufficient to cover end-of-life care without financial stress. "The girls are worried about medical debt," the nurse said quietly. "They're trying to hide it from their mother, but Gloria knows. She's been checking herself out of the hospital against medical advice to avoid accumulating bills that will burden them after she's gone. It's not about the money itself, it's about her inability to accept help from anyone, her conviction that asking for support means weakness. If someone were to handle those bills anonymously, it would remove one source of stress. I can't tell you to do that officially, but I'm telling you anyway." Bert handled Gloria's medical bills that afternoon, not anonymously but openly, sending documentation directly to the hospital billing department with instructions that all charges related to her care should be forwarded to his office. He didn't tell Gloria or the twins, understanding that the gesture would likely be rejected if presented as charity requiring gratitude. He just removed the obstacle quietly and hoped that maybe this one thing he could do without needing permission or thanks would ease some small portion of the suffering his absence had created. By the fourth week of his daily presence, something shifted. Gloria stopped looking at him with pure exhaustion and started showing traces of curiosity, asking questions that went deeper than surface testing. She wanted to know what he'd done with his life beyond building the company, whether he'd married or had other children, if his mother was still making decisions based on money and status instead of actual human connection. He answered everything honestly, admitting that he'd never married because everyone felt wrong after her, that he had no other children because the ones he'd rejected haunted him enough that creating new ones felt like betrayal, that his mother had died bitter and disappointed that he'd chosen personal redemption over family legacy. "Good," Gloria said, when he admitted his mother had never forgiven him for breaking the engagement that would have saved the company. "At least someone held you accountable for destroying futures based on calculations that valued money over people. I hope it hurt. I hope you spent every holiday after that, alone in your big empty house, thinking about what you could have had if you'd been brave enough to choose love over wealth." The venom in her voice was refreshing compared to the careful neutrality she'd been maintaining, suggested that maybe underneath the protective ice she was still angry enough to feel something beyond resignation about the years they'd lost. Bert took it as progress, accepted her fury as his due, and returned the next morning ready to absorb whatever she needed to throw at him until the anger burned itself out and left space for something that might eventually become understanding, if not quite forgiveness. Chapter 4. The Quiet Work of Presence. Nothing dramatic happened during the fifth week of Bert's daily visits, and the absence of crisis felt more significant than any revelation could have been. He arrived at the hospital each morning carrying coffee for Iris and Jade, who'd stopped pretending they didn't appreciate the gesture, even if they still didn't trust his motivations. They'd developed a routine where he'd sit in the waiting area while they took breaks, watching Gloria's door from a distance while his daughters grabbed food or stepped outside for air that didn't smell like disinfectant and approaching death. The rotation happened without discussion, just natural evolution of people learning to coexist in the same space while navigating impossible circumstances. Gloria was awake more often now. The pain management adjusted enough that she could maintain consciousness without suffering quite so visibly. She still looked fragile, still moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had become unreliable, but her eyes held sharpness that suggested her mind remained untouched by the decay consuming her physical form. She watched him through her doorway with assessment that felt both clinical and personal, cataloguing his presence with the thoroughness of someone gathering evidence for a verdict she hadn't yet reached. One morning she gestured for him to enter the room instead of standing in the doorway, and the permission felt monumental, despite being delivered with casual indifference. Bert crossed the threshold carefully, hyper-aware that this was the closest he'd been to her since the night she'd told him about the pregnancy, and pulled a chair to a respectful distance from her bed without presuming the right to crowd her personal space. They sat in silence for what might have been minutes or hours, time losing meaning in hospital rooms where every moment felt simultaneously eternal and fleeting. Gloria seemed content to just exist in his presence without feeling obligated to fill the quiet with conversation, and Bert matched her stillness because pushing for more when she'd given this much would be another form of the greed that had destroyed them in the first place. "Tell me about the company," Gloria said eventually, her voice carrying genuine curiosity instead of judgment. "You saved it after all, despite everything. Your father would be proud." Bert felt the familiar ache of his father's absence, still sharp even after all these years. "I saved the company by destroying everything else worth saving, broke the engagement, lost half our business partners who'd been counting on that merger, worked myself nearly to death for 3 years straight, proving that I could turn things around through sheer stubbornness. By the time the company was stable, I'd become someone my father wouldn't recognize. Cold and calculating and willing to sacrifice anything for success because I'd already sacrificed the only thing that actually mattered." "Don't do that," Gloria said, and her tone held warning instead of sympathy. "Don't make your success into some tragic story about sacrificing love for ambition. You didn't sacrifice me, you rejected me. There's a difference. Sacrifice implies weighing options and choosing the greater good. You just panicked and ran, then spent years building an empire to convince yourself the panic was justified. The accuracy of her assessment cut deeper than kindness would have, stripped away the narrative he'd constructed about being a tragic figure destroyed by impossible circumstances. She was right. He hadn't made some noble choice between love and duty. He'd just been scared and convinced himself that his fear was actually wisdom. "You're right," he admitted, because arguing would just prove he hadn't learned anything. "I was terrified and I ran. And then I spent 15 years telling myself I was searching for you, when really I was just searching for a way to feel less guilty about running." Gloria studied him with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Why are you here, Bert? Really here? Not the pretty story about seeking forgiveness or wanting to know your daughters. What do you actually want from me before I die?" The question demanded honesty that felt dangerous, required him to strip away protective layers and expose the raw truth underneath. "I want you to know that you weren't the problem," he said quietly. "I want you to stop carrying the guilt for my failure. I want you to die understanding that you were always worthy of being chosen, that my inability to see it doesn't diminish that reality. And selfishly, I want to know if there's any part of you that doesn't completely hate me, because spending the rest of my life believing you died hating me might actually be more than I can survive." Gloria's expression softened incrementally, some barrier between them lowering just enough to show the woman beneath the protective ice. "I don't hate you," she said, and the admission seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. "I've tried to hate you, spent years attempting to transform love into something cleaner and easier to carry, but I never managed it. I'm angry at you. I resent the years we lost. I'm furious about dying before getting to see our daughters graduate college or get married or have children of their own. But underneath all of that, there's still some stubborn part of me that remembers loving you, and dying hasn't managed to kill that yet." The confession hung between them like something fragile and dangerous, acknowledgement that 15 years of separation hadn't actually severed the connection they'd formed during those months when everything had felt possible, before fear taught them both that possibility was just another word for risk neither of them could handle properly. Iris appeared in the doorway, breaking the moment with her presence. "Mum, you need to rest. Your heart rate is elevated, and you're supposed to be conserving energy." She looked at Bert with less hostility than usual. "You can come back this afternoon if you want. She's not sending you away. She's just exhausted." Bert stood to leave, understanding that even these small moments of honesty cost Gloria more energy than she could afford to spend. As he reached the door, Gloria's voice stopped him one more time. "Tomorrow, bring photos of yourself from the past 15 years. I want to see what you looked like during all the time we weren't together. I want to know if you aged the way I did, if the years were as hard on you as they were on me, if there's any visible evidence that you suffered the way I suffered." The request felt like another test, another way of measuring whether his claimed regret had actual substance or was just convenient emotion now that consequences had finally caught up with him. Bert agreed and left, spending that evening selecting photos that showed the progression of years on his face, the lines that grief had carved, the exhaustion that came from building success while carrying the weight of catastrophic failure in everything that actually mattered. The afternoon visit started with him spreading photos across Gloria's hospital tray table, a timeline of his life during the years they'd been apart. She studied each one carefully, touching the images with fingers that trembled slightly from medication and illness, tracing the evolution of his face from the young man she'd known to the older version sitting beside her bed. "You look tired," she said finally. Not just normal aging tired, but exhausted in ways that go deeper than just needing sleep. "Good. I'm glad the years weren't kind to you. I'm glad you didn't get to move on and be happy while I was working 3 jobs and raising our daughters alone." The vindictive satisfaction in her voice should have hurt, but instead it felt validating, confirmation that she cared enough to want him to have suffered, that her emotions about him went beyond indifference into territory that suggested maybe the love she mentioned still had some fire left beneath the ashes. They talked about small things that afternoon, carefully avoiding topics that felt too heavy to address before establishing firmer ground. Gloria told him about her business, about the joy she found creating beautiful moments for other people, even when her own moments felt colored by absence and exhaustion. Bert told her about the companies he'd acquired, the deals he'd made, the empire he'd built that meant nothing because there was nobody to inherit it except daughters who rightfully wanted nothing to do with him. When he left that evening, Jade was waiting in the corridor with an expression that suggested she had something important to say. "Mom asked us to give you this," she said, handing him a worn notebook that looked like it had been read repeatedly over years. "It's one of her journals from when we were little. She said you should read it, understand what those years were like for her, stop romanticizing the past into something tragic, when it was actually just hard and lonely and full of choices nobody should have to make alone." Bert took the journal carefully, understanding that this was another form of test, another way Gloria was measuring whether he could handle truth that would hurt. He read it that night in his penthouse, absorbing Gloria's words about pregnancy and fear, and working while exhausted and watching their daughters grow while wondering if he'd ever come looking for what he'd thrown away. Every page was a knife, every entry evidence of suffering he'd caused by choosing panic over presence, but he read every word because avoiding the truth would be another form of the cowardice that had defined too much of his life already. Chapter 5. The Choice She Made. By the 7th week, Gloria's condition had deteriorated enough that the medical team called a family meeting to discuss treatment options that remained despite the grim prognosis, and Bert found himself included in that category, whether anyone was comfortable with it or not. The oncologist was a woman who looked too young to be delivering death sentences, but clearly had enough experience that she'd learned to balance honesty with compassion in proportions that didn't diminish either. She explained that Gloria's cancer had progressed to the point where curative treatment was impossible, but there were still palliative interventions that might extend her life by weeks or potentially months while managing pain that would otherwise become unbearable. "There's also the clinical trial we discussed 8 months ago," the doctor said, directing her words to Gloria instead of making assumptions about who should hear what information. "The one you declined because it required relocation during your daughter's senior year. That trial is still ongoing, still accepting participants who meet your cancer profile. The preliminary results have been even better than we hoped, with some patients achieving significant extension of life expectancy and a few even showing signs of tumor regression." Bert felt hope flare before Gloria's expression shut it down with the efficiency of someone who'd already made peace with dying and didn't appreciate having that peace disrupted by possibilities that came too late to feel like salvation instead of just prolonged suffering. "We already discussed this," Gloria said, and her voice held exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. "The trial requires 6 months of intensive treatment in another state. My daughters have 2 months until college. I'm not going to spend my final time away from them chasing experimental treatments that might give me a few extra months of being sick in a different location." "Mom, we could visit," Iris said, and her voice cracked on words that revealed how desperately she wanted her mother to fight for more time. "We could take gap years, defer college, come with you to wherever the trial is located. We don't care about graduating with our class if it means you might live longer." "Absolutely not," Gloria said with the kind of firmness that shut down argument before it could fully form. "You're not putting your futures on hold because I'm dying. You're not learning that loving someone means sacrificing your own opportunities for theirs. You're not carrying the guilt of wondering if you could have saved me by giving up everything you've worked toward. I made this decision months ago, and I'm not changing it because someone showed up at the last minute and started making everyone question choices that were never wrong in the first place." The accusation was clearly directed at Bert, blaming him for disrupting the peace Gloria had established around her own death. He absorbed the impact without defending himself because she was right. His presence had complicated what should have been straightforward, introduced hope where Gloria had carefully cultivated acceptance, made everyone wonder if fighting was possible when surrender had already been negotiated. "Why did you refuse treatment in the first place?" Bert asked, needing to understand the full calculus that had led to her choosing death over possibility. When the cancer was first detected, why didn't you pursue aggressive intervention when it was still treatable? Gloria's laugh was bitter enough to corrode metal. Because I had no insurance and the treatment cost more than I made in 2 years. Because I was barely keeping my business afloat while raising 2 children alone. Because asking for help would have meant admitting I couldn't handle everything myself. And I'd spent the girls' entire childhood teaching them that we didn't need anyone else's charity or pity. So I gambled that I could manage it conservatively until I was successful enough to afford proper treatment, and I lost that gamble. By the time I could pay for intervention, the cancer had spread beyond the point where standard treatment could cure it. "You could have called me," Bert said, and his voice shook with fury directed at her stubbornness as much as at his own absence. "One phone call and I would have paid for everything. The best doctors, experimental treatments, whatever it took to save you. You chose to die rather than ask me for help, and now our daughters are losing their mother because you were too proud to admit you needed support." The room went silent, everyone frozen by the accusation that transformed Gloria's martyrdom into something uglier than noble sacrifice. She stared at him with eyes that held fury and pain in equal measure, clearly not expecting him to challenge the narrative she'd constructed about making necessary choices instead of self-destructive ones. "Don't you dare," Gloria said, and her voice carried steel despite her physical fragility. "Don't you dare come into this hospital after 15 years of absence and blame me for dying. You made it clear when I was pregnant that complications weren't your problem. You taught me that asking you for anything meant admitting I wasn't strong enough to handle life alone. You trained me to believe that needing help was weakness, and now you want to act shocked that I internalized that lesson? You don't get to be angry at me for learning what you taught." Iris and Jade watched their parents' first real fight with expressions that suggested they'd been waiting for this moment, for the careful politeness to crack and reveal the rage underneath. The oncologist excused herself quietly, understanding that this conversation needed to happen without medical professionals bearing witness to years of accumulated resentment finally finding voice. "You're right that I failed you," Bert said, standing because sitting felt impossible when fury demanded movement. "I was a coward who chose fear over love, and you paid the price for my failure. But you failed too, Gloria. You decided I was irredeemable and never gave me the chance to prove otherwise. You raised our daughters alone not just because I abandoned you, but because you were too proud to let me try making it right. You're dying because you'd rather die than be vulnerable, and that's not strength, that's just a different kind of cowardice than mine." Gloria tried to respond, but her body betrayed her, a coughing fit seizing her with enough violence that Iris rushed to help her sit forward while Jade adjusted oxygen tubes that had become displaced during the argument. When the coughing finally subsided, Gloria's face was ashen and her breathing labored in ways that made monitors start beeping warnings about elevated heart rate and decreased oxygen saturation. "Get out," Jade said to Bert, and her voice held protective fury instead of the complicated neutrality she'd been developing toward him. "You've done enough damage for one day. Mum doesn't need your anger on top of everything else she's dealing with. She doesn't need you making her question decisions that were never wrong just because you showed up and started projecting your guilt onto her choices." Bert left because staying would just prove that he still couldn't recognize when his presence caused more harm than good, but he went only as far as the waiting room, where he could still see Gloria's door and monitor the medical activity, suggesting his outburst had triggered a health crisis she didn't have energy to survive. A nurse he recognized from previous visits approached him with an expression that managed to combine sympathy and judgment in equal measure. "She's been in and out of the hospital for 3 years, the nurse said quietly. "Every time she checks herself out early against medical advice because she can't afford to stay longer or doesn't want her daughters to see her at her weakest. She's been dying slowly while working through pain that would cripple most people, hiding her suffering so expertly that her daughters only discovered the full extent recently. And through all of that, she's maintained dignity and grace, that most patients can't manage. So whatever anger you're carrying about her choices, maybe consider that she's made every decision alone because that's what circumstances forced her to do. The words landed like indictment, another voice joining the chorus telling him that Gloria's failures were really just his failures wearing her face. Bert sat in the waiting room watching medical staff stabilize her yet again, understanding that his anger hadn't been about her stubbornness so much as about his own helplessness in the face of consequences he'd created but couldn't fix. Hours later, when Gloria had been stabilized enough that visiting was permitted again, Jade approached him with the wary expression of someone delivering a message she didn't entirely agree with. "Mum wants to see you," she said reluctantly. "She's angry at you for what you said, but she also said you were right about some of it, and she wants to finish the conversation before deciding whether to ban you permanently." Bert entered Gloria's room to find her looking smaller and more fragile than before, the medical crisis having stolen what little energy reserves she'd been maintaining. But her eyes were clear, focused on him with intensity that suggested whatever she was about to say had been carefully considered during the hours they'd been apart. "I've been thinking about what you said," Gloria began without preamble, "about me choosing to die rather than ask for help. And you're partially right. I did make that choice, but not for the reasons you think. I didn't refuse treatment because I was too proud to ask you specifically for money. I refused treatment because asking anyone for help meant admitting that I'd failed at building the independent life I'd promised our daughters was possible. It meant teaching them that women can't actually survive without men to rescue them, that all my talk about strength and resilience was just empty rhetoric hiding dependency I'd never outgrown." She paused to catch her breath, the effort of sustained speech clearly costing more than she wanted to admit. "So yes, I chose death over asking for support, not because of you specifically, but because of what asking would represent about everything I'd tried to teach Iris and Jade about their own capability and worth. And maybe that was wrong. Maybe teaching our daughters that asking for help is weakness has done more damage than I realized. But don't pretend your anger is actually about my stubbornness when it's really about your guilt, finally having somewhere to go besides yourself." Chapter 6. The Daughter's Burden. Iris and Jade sat in the hospital cafeteria long after midnight, drinking terrible coffee and processing the reality that their parents were both right and both catastrophically wrong in ways that had cost them all a family they should have had. "I found Mom's journals when I was 13, Iris admitted, and the confession felt both liberating and shameful. "I'd been looking for insurance documents because Mom was having chest pains she kept brushing off as stress. Instead, I found boxes of notebooks hidden in the back of her closet, years of writing that was never meant for our eyes." Jade stared at her sister with shock that suggested this revelation was news, despite them being close enough to share most secrets. "You never told me. You let me find them 2 years later and act like it was this big discovery when you'd already known everything." "Because reading them destroyed something in me," Iris said, and her voice cracked on words she'd been holding back for years. "I learned that Mom had been in love with someone who rejected her, that she'd spent our entire childhood carrying that rejection like an open wound that never healed, that every choice she made about raising us alone was actually about protecting us from a father who didn't want us. And I couldn't tell you because you were still young enough to believe Mom's beautiful lies about him being a good man who just wasn't ready. I couldn't take that from you when I was barely surviving having it taken from me." They sat in silence while Jade processed this information, understanding shifting across her features as she recognized the weight her sister had been carrying alone. "What did the journals say about him?" she asked finally. "The truth, not the sanitized version Mum told us." Iris pulled out her phone and scrolled to photos she'd taken of specific journal pages, unable to carry the physical notebooks, but needing the words preserved as evidence that her memory hadn't exaggerated the devastation. She read aloud passages that described their parents' relationship with detail that made them both uncomfortable, Gloria's voice from years ago describing a man who was brilliant but broken, ambitious but lost, someone who'd needed her in ways he couldn't articulate, and she couldn't resist. She loved him completely, Iris said, her voice flat with exhaustion. Loved him enough that when he rejected us, she blamed herself instead of him. Wrote pages and pages about how she must not have been enough, how she should have been stronger or more patient or less complicated. She apologized to him in her journals for years, took responsibility for his failure, protected him from consequences he deserved. Jade took the phone and read the passages herself, seeing their mother's pain laid out in handwriting that shook from emotion even all those years ago. Why didn't she hate him? She asked, and her voice held the confusion of someone who'd never understood how love and hurt could coexist in the same space. Why didn't she just let herself be angry instead of turning all that pain inward and making it about her own inadequacy? Because she loved him too much to hate him, Iris said simply. And because hating him would have meant admitting that the man she chose to create us with was someone capable of cruelty, which would have made us products of her bad judgment instead of just unfortunate timing. So she constructed this narrative where he was good but scared, where circumstances kept them apart instead of his cowardice, where she was the one who chose to leave because it was easier than watching him resent us. They pulled up Gloria's hospital room on the monitoring app that let them track her vitals from anywhere in the building, watching the numbers that represented their mother's failing systems with the helpless dread of people who understood that machines could track deterioration but not stop it. Her heart rate was elevated, oxygen levels lower than they should be, evidence that the argument with Bert had taken a toll she couldn't afford to pay. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Jade asked, staring at the numbers like they might contain answers to questions that had no good solutions. Letting him be here, letting him into Mom's final days after 15 years of absence. What if we're just enabling his guilt trip instead of actually helping Mom find peace? Iris didn't have a good answer, because the question had been haunting her since the moment they'd decided to allow Bert access to Gloria's doorway. "I think Mum needed this confrontation," she said slowly, working through thoughts she hadn't fully formed yet. She's been carrying his rejection for 15 years, apologizing to his ghost, taking responsibility for his failure. Maybe having him actually here, actually seeing what his choices cost, is the only way she can finally stop protecting him and start being angry at him the way she deserves. "But what if the anger kills her faster?" Jade countered, voicing the fear they'd both been avoiding. "What if dredging up all this pain means she dies sooner and more miserably than if we'd just kept him away? Then at least she dies having finally told him the truth instead of carrying it to her grave," Iris said, with the conviction of someone who'd thought this through from every angle. "She spent our entire childhood protecting him from consequences. Maybe it's time he faces what he created, understands the full cost of his cowardice, lives with that knowledge for the rest of his life, the way she's lived with it for all of ours." They talked through the night about their own feelings toward Bert, the complicated mixture of resentment and curiosity and grudging recognition that he'd shown up and stayed when disappearing would have been easier. Jade admitted that she'd researched him extensively, read articles about his business success and philanthropic work, found mentions of large anonymous donations to women's shelters and organizations supporting single mothers, evidence that suggested his guilt had found expression in trying to help others avoid the struggles Gloria had faced. He established a scholarship fund, Jade said, pulling up the information on her phone, for daughters of single mothers pursuing business degrees. The application criteria are oddly specific. Must be from low-income backgrounds, must have worked while attending school, must demonstrate resilience in the face of hardship. It's like he created a scholarship specifically designed for us, except we'd never qualify because Mum made enough money eventually that we don't count as low income anymore. The information complicated their narrative about Bert being purely selfish, suggested that maybe his guilt had motivated some actual good, even if it couldn't undo the harm he'd caused their mother. Iris found more evidence of Bert's attempts at indirect redemption, policy advocacy for better healthcare access, lobbying for laws that would prevent women from facing the impossible choice between treating cancer and bankrupting their families. support for legislation, making it easier for single parents to access childcare and education. He's been trying to fix the systemic problems that hurt Mom, Iris said, recognizing the pattern in his philanthropic work. He can't undo what he did to her specifically, so he's attempting to prevent other women from facing the same impossible choices. It's both admirable and completely insufficient, helping strangers while the woman who actually needed his help was dying alone. Dawn found them still in the cafeteria, surrounded by empty coffee cups, and the kind of exhaustion that came from processing years of accumulated grief in a single night. They returned to their mother's room to find her awake, watching them with eyes that missed nothing despite the medications that should have dulled her perceptions. "You've been talking about him," Gloria said, and it wasn't a question. "Trying to figure out if your father is villain or victim, whether to hate him or pity him, or some complicated mixture of both. I've spent 15 years trying to solve that same equation, and I still don't have a good answer. He failed catastrophically, but he was also young and terrified and drowning in circumstances that would have crushed someone stronger. He made the worst choice possible, but he made it from fear instead of malice. He destroyed us, but he destroyed himself in the process too." Iris moved to her mother's bedside, taking her hand carefully because Gloria's bones felt too fragile to withstand even gentle pressure. "What do you want us to feel about him?" she asked. "What would make this easier for you as you're dying?" Gloria's smile was sad and tired, and held wisdom that came from years of loving someone who'd never learned how to love her back properly. "I want you to see him as complicated instead of simple. I want you to understand that people can love each other and still destroy each other, that good intentions don't prevent catastrophic harm, that your father's failure doesn't erase his capability for eventual growth, even if that growth came too late to save us. I want you to have the relationship with him that I couldn't give you, because I was too busy being strong enough for everyone. I want you to let him be your father, flawed and imperfect, and trying desperately to make up for time he can never get back." "Even if it means forgiving him before you're ready?" Jade asked, her voice carrying the resistance of someone who'd built her identity around protecting her mother from the man who'd hurt her. "Especially then," Gloria said firmly, "because holding on to this anger after I'm gone will just mean I've taught you to carry grudges that eat you alive from the inside. I don't want my death to be the gift that keeps taking, the wound that never heals, because you're too loyal to my memory to let yourselves move forward. Your father showed up, he stayed. He faced the consequences of his choices instead of running again. That deserves something, even if it's not complete absolution." The twins looked at each other, communicating silently about whether to accept their mother's directive or hold firm to the protective anger that had sustained them through discovering the truth about their family's broken foundation. Finally, Iris spoke with the careful precision of someone making a promise she wasn't certain she could keep. "We'll try, not for him, for you. We'll give him the chance to be our father and see if he's capable of actually following through instead of just performing guilt until the performance gets too hard. But if he fails us the way he failed you, if he disappears or stops trying or decides that redemption requires too much actual effort, then we reserve the right to cut him out completely and never look back." Gloria nodded acceptance of the conditional forgiveness, understanding that it was more than she'd expected and possibly more than Bert deserved. "That's all I'm asking," she said quietly, "just the chance for him to prove he's learned how to be brave enough to stay." Chapter 7. The Truth Between Them. The 9th week brought a shift in Gloria's condition that the medical team described as entering the final stage, language that meant her body was beginning the process of shutting down in ways that couldn't be reversed or delayed much longer, regardless of interventions they attempted. Bert had been sitting in her room when the doctor delivered this news, no longer relegated to the doorway, but allowed inside with the understanding that his presence was now accepted, if not quite welcomed. Gloria had insisted he stay for the conversation, saying she didn't want information filtered through other people's interpretations when she needed to understand exactly how much time remained and what that time would look like in terms of symptoms and suffering. Days. Maybe a week at most. the doctor said, with the blunt honesty of someone who'd learned that euphemisms didn't actually soften death's approach. Your organs are beginning to fail in sequence. The cancer has spread to the point where your body can't maintain basic functions anymore. We can manage the pain, keep you comfortable, but we can't stop the progression. I'm sorry. Gloria absorbed this information with the calm of someone who'd been preparing for exactly this news, nodded acceptance of mortality that had stopped being theoretical and become immediate. "Thank you for being direct," she said. "I appreciate not having to guess based on careful language designed to protect my feelings from reality." After the doctor left, silence filled the room with the weight of everything that remained unsaid between them. Bert wanted to fill that silence with apologies and promises and all the words he'd been rehearsing for years. But Gloria's expression suggested she needed quiet more than she needed his verbal processing of grief he'd barely begun experiencing while she'd been living with her impending death for years. "Tell me about the morning after I left," Gloria said eventually, her voice carrying genuine curiosity instead of accusation. "What did you do when you woke up and I was gone? What did you feel when you realized I'd actually left instead of just threatening to?" The question caught him off guard, too specific and personal to be casual inquiry. Bert thought back to that morning, to waking alone in the bed where they'd slept, tangled together the night before she'd told him about the pregnancy, to finding the note she'd left that said simply that she couldn't stay with someone who saw their children as problems to be solved instead of people to be loved. "I panicked," he admitted, "because lying now would just be another form of the cowardice that had brought them to this moment. Not because I immediately realized my mistake, but because I'd been counting on you to give me more time to figure out what to say, to come up with the right words that would make everything okay without requiring me to actually change anything. When I couldn't find you anywhere, when I realized you'd actually left for real, I felt this combination of relief and terror that made me hate myself." Gloria watched him with those sharp eyes that had always seen through his carefully constructed defenses. "Relief that you didn't have to deal with the pregnancy? Or relief that the decision had been made for you so you could pretend it was out of your hands?" "Both," Bert said, and the admission tasted like ash. "Relief that I didn't have to choose between you and the company, between love and duty, between what I wanted and what I thought I was supposed to do. And then terror when I realized that you'd taken that choice away, but that didn't actually make me feel better. I'd thought I wanted an escape, but when you gave me one I just felt empty, like I'd been hollowed out and left with nothing but the echo of where you used to be." He described breaking off his engagement that afternoon, the fight with his mother that had ended with her telling him he'd destroyed the family's legacy for a woman who hadn't even wanted him enough to stay. He described the year that followed, working himself nearly to death, rebuilding the company, while searching desperately for any trace of Gloria's existence, convinced that if he could just find her and apologize and explain, everything could still be fixed. "But I couldn't find you," Bert continued, his voice rough with old grief. "You'd disappeared so completely it was like you'd never existed except in my memories. And eventually I had to accept that you'd chosen to stay hidden, that you didn't want to be found, that my chance at fixing things had passed before I'd even realized I'd destroyed them. So I just kept working, kept building, kept searching with less hope each year until searching became more habit than actual expectation of success." Gloria listened without interrupting, letting him expose himself fully before offering her own truth in return. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of years spent constructing and deconstructing the narrative of their relationship until she'd found something she could live with. "I didn't leave to punish you," she said quietly. "I left because I loved you too much to watch you resent me. I could see the terror in your face when I told you about the pregnancy, the way you were already calculating how to escape before I'd even finished speaking. I knew if I stayed, if I forced you into fatherhood you clearly didn't want, you'd grow to hate me for trapping you. And I loved you too much to turn into the person you blamed for destroying your dreams." She described the weeks after leaving, living in a shelter while trying to figure out how to survive as a single mother before the twins were even born. She described the fear that consumed her every night, wondering if she'd made a catastrophic mistake by walking away from the only person who might have helped her navigate the impossible situation she was facing. She described the temptation to call him, to beg him to reconsider, to offer to get rid of the pregnancy, if it meant he'd love her again the way he had before. Complications made love feel impossible. "But I didn't call," Gloria said, and her voice held both pride and regret. "Because I knew that if you chose us out of guilt or obligation, it would poison everything eventually. I wanted you to choose us because you wanted us, not because I'd manipulated you into it through desperation or tears. So I stayed away, raised our daughters alone, built a life that didn't need you so they'd never feel like they were missing something essential to their wholeness." Bert felt tears burning down his face, the first time he'd cried in front of her, despite the weeks of accumulated grief that had been building since he'd first found out she was dying. "I would have chosen you if I'd been brave enough," he said. "Every version of our story where I'm not a coward ends with us together, raising Iris and Jade as a family, building something beautiful instead of destroying it before it had the chance to exist. The fact that I wasn't brave enough is the defining failure of my life." "But you weren't brave enough," Gloria said with brutal honesty, "and I wasn't brave enough to make you try. We were both young and scared and convinced that protecting ourselves from potential hurt was more important than fighting for potential joy. We destroyed each other through fear dressed up as wisdom, and now I'm dying without ever knowing what we could have been if either of us had been strong enough to risk everything on love." They sat in silence while truth settled between them. Years of protective lies finally stripped away to reveal the ugly foundation underneath. Neither of them had been villains or victims, just two people who'd loved each other but loved their self-protection more, who'd chosen safety over possibility and paid the price in years of loneliness and regret that no amount of success or strength could actually heal. "I'm sorry," Bert said, knowing it was inadequate but needing to say it anyway. "For all of it. For not being brave enough to choose you, for not searching hard enough to find you, for building an empire while you were surviving alone, for showing up now when it's too late to change anything except maybe how you feel as you're dying." Gloria reached for his hand with fingers that trembled from medication and illness, held it with the same gentle grip she'd used all those years ago when they danced in his penthouse and pretended the world outside didn't exist. "I'm sorry too," she said quietly, "for leaving without giving you the chance to surprise me, for raising our daughters to be so independent they don't know how to ask for help, for choosing death over vulnerability, for all the ways my fear mirrored yours, even while I was judging you for being afraid." They held each other's hands while machines beeped and monitors tracked Gloria's failing systems. Two people finally honest about the mutual destruction they'd caused, the love that hadn't been enough to overcome their respective cowardice, the family that could have existed if they'd just been brave enough to believe in possibility instead of protecting themselves from disappointment. "Tell me about them," Bert said eventually, needing to fill the silence with something other than the sound of Gloria's labored breathing. "Tell me about Iris and Jade, about who they became despite my absence. Tell me everything I missed so I can at least know what I lost, even if I can never get it back." Gloria smiled, and for the first time since he'd found her in this hospital bed, the expression reached her eyes and transformed her face into something that looked like the woman he'd loved before fear taught them both to run from everything that mattered. She began talking about their daughters, describing them with the loving detail of someone who dedicated her life to knowing them completely, and Bert listened like his survival depended on absorbing every word, because maybe it did. Chapter 8. The Vigil Without Answers. The final week existed outside normal time, hours stretching into eternities while simultaneously passing too quickly for anyone to process the reality of what was ending before having the chance to begin. Bert stopped leaving the hospital entirely, sleeping in the chair beside Gloria's bed when exhaustion forced rest, waking to find Iris or Jade had covered him with a blanket at some point during the night. His empire continued running through competent executives who'd been trained to function without his constant oversight. Board members who stopped calling after he made it clear that nothing short of total collapse would pull him away from this hospital room, where the only thing that had ever really mattered was slowly dying. Gloria drifted in and out of consciousness. The pain medications increased to levels that made lucidity intermittent, but necessary to manage suffering that would otherwise be unbearable. When she was awake, they talked about small things, carefully avoiding topics that felt too heavy to address when every conversation might be their last. She told him about her favorite clients, the weddings and events she'd coordinated that had brought her joy, even when her personal life felt colored by absence and exhaustion. He told her about business deals that had challenged him, problems he'd solved that required creativity instead of just money, moments when he'd felt almost human despite the emptiness that defined his existence. Iris and Jade maintained constant presence, taking shifts so their mother was never alone, including Bert in their rotation with the understanding that he'd earned this place through weeks of showing up, even when showing up accomplished nothing visible. They brought him coffee and food he barely touched, reminded him to shower and change clothes in the hospital's family facilities, treated him with the careful kindness reserved for people who were suffering in ways that deserved witnessing, even if they couldn't be fixed. One afternoon when Gloria was sleeping and the twins had stepped out for air, a woman Bert didn't recognize entered the room and studied him with the assessing gaze of someone gathering evidence for a verdict not yet reached. She introduced herself as Gloria's best friend from the early years, the one who'd witnessed the struggle to survive as a single mother while building a business from nothing. "She talked about you constantly," the friend said without preamble. "For the first few years after she left, you were all she could think about. She'd cry on the anniversary of when you met, turn down dates with men who would have made excellent partners because they weren't you. Keep your photo hidden where the girls wouldn't find it, but where she could look at it when the loneliness became unbearable. I watched her torture herself, loving someone who'd rejected her, and I hated you for making her carry that weight alone." Bert absorbed the accusation without defending himself, because there was no defense for truth delivered with surgical precision. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing it was inadequate but having nothing better to offer. "Don't apologize to me," the friend said sharply. "I'm not the one who suffered. I'm just the one who had to watch my best friend slowly kill herself through self-sacrifice, disguised as strength, while the man responsible for half her children lived in luxury and convinced himself that searching without finding was the same as actually trying. But I'm here to tell you something Gloria won't say because she spent 15 years protecting you from consequences you deserve to face." She pulled out a worn notebook, one of Gloria's journals that she'd apparently been given permission to share in the event that Gloria's death came before certain truths were delivered. "Read page 47, the friend instructed. "Read what she wrote 3 years ago when she got the cancer diagnosis. Read it and understand what your rejection actually cost." Bert took the journal and found the marked page, recognizing Gloria's handwriting even though illness had made it shakier than he remembered. The entry was dated from when the twins were in their early teens, describing the moment Gloria had received confirmation that the cancer she'd been trying to manage conservatively had progressed beyond the point where standard treatment could cure it. The words destroyed him in ways he hadn't thought possible after weeks of accumulated grief. Gloria had written about her first thought upon learning she was dying. Relief that Bert would never have to know. Relief that she could spare him the guilt of watching her suffer from a disease that better healthcare access might have prevented. She'd written about deciding not to reach out, not to tell him about the daughters he'd rejected, not to burden him with the knowledge that his absence had contributed to her death in ways that went beyond the emotional toll of rejection. "She was going to write to you," the friend said, taking the journal back. "Had the letter drafted and ready to mail. She was finally going to tell you about Iris and Jade, give you the chance to know them before they graduated high school and moved away to college. Then the diagnosis came, and she burned the letter. Decided you didn't deserve to have your peace disrupted by a dying woman and traumatized daughters. She chose to disappear permanently rather than let you see her weak, and that choice is the reason you only found out now when it's too late to matter." Bert felt something crack in his chest that went deeper than the grief he'd been managing for weeks. Gloria had been planning to reach out, had been ready to give him the chance at redemption he'd been desperately seeking, and circumstances had stolen that opportunity from both of them. They could have had years instead of weeks. The twins could have known him while their mother was still healthy enough to supervise the relationship. He could have helped with medical bills that might have bought time for better treatments to become available. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't contain. "Because Gloria thinks you should know that circumstances played a role in your separation, that it wasn't just your mutual cowardice, but actual bad luck that kept you apart. She wants you to forgive yourself eventually, to not spend the rest of your life carrying guilt for things that were partly outside your control. She's protecting you even while dying, and I think you should know that, so you can at least appreciate the grace she's giving you that you never gave her." The friend left, and Bert sat alone with the knowledge that Gloria's love for him had survived 15 years, and a terminal diagnosis, that she'd been actively trying to reconnect when illness intervened, that some of their tragedy was truly circumstance, instead of just failure of character and courage. The information should have brought comfort, but instead it just made the loss feel more unbearable because it suggested possibilities that had been stolen by timing instead of choice. When Gloria woke that evening, Bert told her what her friend had revealed, watching her face cycle through emotions as she realized her attempt at protecting his feelings had been overridden by someone who thought truth mattered more than comfortable lies. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, before speaking with the careful precision of someone choosing words that would survive after she couldn't clarify or correct them. "I was going to tell you about the girls," she admitted. "I'd finally accepted that keeping you away from them was hurting all of us, that whatever damage your rejection had caused couldn't be worse than denying them the chance to know their father. I'd written this whole letter explaining everything, apologizing for keeping them from you, asking if you'd be willing to meet them with no expectations beyond basic civility. Then I got the diagnosis and everything changed. I couldn't bear the thought of you seeing me dying, of our first contact in 15 years being motivated by pity instead of genuine desire to reconnect." "I would have wanted to reconnect regardless of the cancer," Bert said. "I would have paid for treatment, hired the best doctors, done anything to give you more time with our daughters. You robbed us both of that possibility by deciding what I did or didn't deserve to know." Gloria's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger before exhaustion buried it beneath resignation. "You're right. I made that choice for both of us, just like you made the choice to reject our pregnancy without consulting me about alternatives. We're both guilty of deciding what the other person needed instead of actually asking, and now we're both living with consequences of choices that should have been made together." They sat in silence while truth settled between them again, another layer of protective lies stripped away to reveal mutual failures that went deeper than either of them had wanted to acknowledge. The machines beeped their steady rhythm, tracking Gloria's decline, marking time they didn't have enough of, counting down to an ending neither of them had wanted, but both of them had helped create through choices made in fear instead of love. "I don't forgive you yet," Gloria said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I never will, but I release you from the guilt of my death. I made choices that contributed to this outcome, refused help that might have saved me, prioritized pride over survival in ways that were nobody's fault but my own. You failed me catastrophically 15 years ago, but what happened after was my responsibility to manage, and I managed it poorly by teaching our daughters that strength means never asking for support. So we're both guilty, both responsible, both dying in different ways from the same disease of being too afraid to be vulnerable." The admission hung between them like something fragile and dangerous, acknowledgement that blame could be shared without being diluted, that Gloria's suffering didn't erase Bert's failure, but also didn't exist solely because of it. They'd both made terrible choices that fed off each other in destructive cycles, and now they were paying the price in ways that felt both deserved and unbearably cruel. Chapter 9. When the Body Decides. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning, Gloria's body choosing its moment to begin the final shutdown, with timing that felt both arbitrary and inevitable in ways that suggested mortality followed no schedule that made sense to the people left behind. Bert had been dozing in his chair when alarms started screaming, pulling him from restless sleep into the chaos of medical staff rushing into the room with equipment and urgent efficiency. Gloria was conscious, her eyes wide with terror that looked wrong on a face that had maintained composure through everything else, and Bert understood immediately that this was different from previous scares, that her body was finally giving up in ways that couldn't be stabilized or reversed. "Her kidneys are failing," one of the doctors said, speaking to Iris and Jade, who'd appeared from somewhere in response to the crisis. "We can put her on dialysis to manage the immediate symptoms, buy maybe a few more days, but it will be uncomfortable, and we need to know if that's what she wants or if we should focus purely on comfort measures at this point." Gloria tried to speak, but couldn't get enough air to form words, the oxygen mask covering her face, delivering support her lungs couldn't manage independently. She reached for something to write with, and a nurse provided pen and paper with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd helped dying patients communicate when speech became impossible. Her handwriting was nearly illegible, shaking from medication and organ failure combined, but the word she wrote was clear enough for everyone to understand. "Comfort," she'd scrawled, followed by, "No dialysis, no machines, just let me go." "Mom, no," Jade said, and her voice broke on the plea. "We can buy more time, a few more days to say goodbye, to make sure we've told you everything that matters. Please don't give up yet." Gloria shook her head, reached for the pen again, wrote with effort that made her whole body tremble. "Ready, tired, love you, let go." Bert watched Iris and Jade struggle with their mother's directive, saw them war between respecting her autonomy and the desperate need to keep her alive even a few more hours. He understood the impulse because he'd been fighting the same battle since arriving at the hospital, wanting Gloria to have peace while simultaneously wanting her to stay, regardless of cost, because her absence would leave a hole in the world that could never be filled. "We should honor what she wants," Bert said quietly, and both daughters turned to him with expressions that suggested they'd forgotten he was there. "She's been suffering for years, hiding pain to spare you the burden of watching her deteriorate. If she's ready to stop fighting, we owe her the grace of accepting that choice instead of forcing her to endure more just because we're not ready to let go." The doctors adjusted Gloria's medication, transitioning from aggressive intervention to palliative care that would keep her comfortable while her body completed the shutdown it had already begun. The chaos settled into quieter urgency, medical staff moving with purpose but without the frantic energy that came from trying to reverse the irreversible. Gloria's breathing became more labored despite the oxygen, her body struggling against the inevitable with automatic resistance, even though her mind had already accepted what was coming. She reached for Iris first, pulled her close enough to whisper something Bert couldn't hear, then did the same with Jade. Both daughters were crying silently, tears streaming down their faces, while they listened to whatever final words their mother was giving them. Wisdom meant specifically for them that would have to sustain them through whatever came after. Then Gloria gestured for Bert, and he moved to her bedside with careful steps that felt like approaching something sacred and dangerous in equal measure. She pulled him close, her grip surprisingly strong for someone whose organs were failing in sequence, and spoke directly into his ear with voice that was barely audible but carried absolute clarity despite the oxygen mask. "I lied earlier," she whispered, and Bert felt his heart stop because he didn't know what truth was coming, but knew it would destroy him. "I said I don't forgive you yet, that maybe I never would. But that was pride talking, not truth. I forgave you years ago, probably forgave you the morning after I left when I was still angry enough that forgiveness felt like betrayal of my own hurt. I forgave you because holding on to anger was eating me alive, because our daughters deserved a mother who wasn't poisoned by resentment, because loving you meant accepting that people fail catastrophically without stopping being worthy of eventual grace." She paused to catch her breath, the effort of sustained speech costing more than she could really afford, but apparently necessary enough that she pushed through anyway. "But here's the part I need you to understand. Forgiving you didn't mean your failure stopped hurting. It didn't erase the years of raising our daughters alone, or the loneliness that never quite went away, or the cancer that might have been treatable if I'd had better access to healthcare. Forgiveness just meant I stopped letting your failure define my worth, stopped carrying your guilt as evidence of my inadequacy. So yes, I forgive you. But you still have to live with what you did. Still have to face the consequences of choosing fear over love. Still have to figure out how to be the father to our daughters that you should have been from the beginning. Bert felt tears streaming down his face, mixing with Gloria's as he held her close enough to feel her heartbeat against his chest, irregular and weakening, but still there for whatever time remained. I don't know how to do this without you, he admitted. I don't know how to be their father when I don't know how to be anything except the man who failed them before they were born. You learn, Gloria said with the last of her strength. You show up, even when it's hard. You stay, even when running would be easier. You love them without conditions, without expectations, without the fear that kept you from loving them in the first place. You do all the things I had to learn alone, except you have the advantage of knowing what failure looks like, so maybe you'll be brave enough to choose differently this time. She released him and fell back against the pillows, exhausted from the conversation and the effort of dying, while still maintaining enough consciousness to say goodbye properly. The twins moved back to their mother's bedside, one on each side, and Bert stepped away to give them privacy for whatever final moments family meant, when family was defined by the people who'd actually shown up when showing up mattered. Hours passed in that strange, compressed time that existed in hospital rooms where people were dying. Gloria drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally waking enough to squeeze her daughter's hands or mouth words of love that didn't need voice to carry meaning. The medical team checked in periodically, adjusting medications to manage pain without hastening or prolonging the inevitable, walking the careful line between comfort and euthanasia that defined end-of-life care. As evening approached, Gloria's breathing changed rhythm, becoming more irregular and shallow in ways the nurses recognized as signs that final hours were approaching. They moved quietly, offering water and tissues and the kind of compassionate presence that acknowledged the sacredness of bearing witness to death without pretending it was anything other than devastating. Bert sat in the corner of the room, giving the twins space to be with their mother while staying close enough that Gloria could see him if she opened her eyes, honoring her request that he be present but not central to her dying. He watched Iris and Jade hold their mother's hands, tell her stories about memories they'd shared, promise her they'd be okay even though none of them believed it yet, and understood that this was what family looked like when built on actual presence instead of biological connection alone. Gloria opened her eyes one final time as sunset light filtered through the hospital window, looked at each person in the room with focused intensity that suggested she was memorizing faces to carry with her wherever death was taking her. She mouthed words that might have been, "I love you," or "thank you," or "goodbye," or some combination of all three, and then her eyes drifted closed for what everyone in the room understood was likely the last time. But she didn't die that night. Her breathing continued its irregular pattern, her heart kept beating despite failing systems, her body refusing to surrender even though her mind had already made peace with ending. The vigil stretched into another day, then another, existence suspended between life and death, while everyone waited for resolution that felt simultaneously inevitable and impossible to accept. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. Gloria woke on the third day of what should have been her final hours, conscious and clear-eyed in ways that defied medical expectations and suggested her body had found reserves nobody knew existed, and the first words out of her mouth were delivered with fury that made everyone in the room freeze. "Get out," she said to Bert, and her voice carried steel despite her physical weakness. "I gave you forgiveness. I gave you access to our daughters. I gave you everything except what you actually wanted, which was absolution without accountability. Now get out because I'm not dying as your redemption arc. not spending my final conscious moments making you feel better about 15 years of choosing wrong. The outburst was so unexpected after days of careful gentleness that Bert initially thought the medications were causing confusion, but Gloria's eyes were focused and her meaning unmistakable. She was angry in ways she'd been suppressing through weeks of his presence, and whatever dam had been holding back that rage had finally broken under the pressure of approaching death. "I've been lying to you," Gloria continued, before Bert could respond. "I've been so busy being gracious and forgiving and making sure you got your moment of reconciliation that I haven't told you how furious I am. Not just about the pregnancy, about all of it. About you searching for me but not hard enough. About you building an empire while I was surviving on food stamps. About you getting to be the tragic figure who suffered from his own cowardice while I was the one actually living with consequences. About you showing up now and expecting gratitude for finally doing the bare minimum of acknowledging our daughters exist." Iris and Jade watched their mother with expressions that suggested they'd been waiting for this explosion, that they'd seen it building beneath Gloria's careful composure and understood it needed release before death took away the chance for honest anger. Bert stood frozen, understanding that whatever he said would be wrong, but that silence would be equally inadequate. "You want to know what the worst part was?" Gloria asked, and she didn't wait for answer. It wasn't the poverty or the exhaustion or even the cancer. It was the hope. Every year on the anniversary of when we met, I hoped you'd find me. Every time someone knocked on my door, I hoped it was you finally coming to apologize. Every birthday the girls had, I hoped you'd somehow know and show up with 15 years of missed presents. I hoped like an idiot for years before I finally learned that hope was just another word for self-torture, and by then it was too late because hope had already eaten away parts of me that never healed properly. She tried to sit up, failed, settled for just staring at him with accusation that felt physical in its intensity. "And now you're here. And you think showing up at my deathbed makes you noble instead of just convenient. You think forgiving you gives you permission to stop feeling guilty, to move forward with our daughters like the past 15 years didn't happen, to build the relationship with them that you should have been building all along. But forgiveness doesn't work like that. Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences or make your failure stop mattering. It just means I'm tired of carrying your guilt for you while you build monuments to your own suffering." Bert felt his own anger rising to meet hers, fury that had been simmering beneath his careful contrition for weeks, finally finding voice. "You want to talk about carrying guilt?" he said, and his voice shook with emotion he'd been suppressing. "You've spent 15 years martyring yourself on the altar of independence, teaching our daughters that asking for help is weakness, dying rather than being vulnerable enough to admit you needed support. You're so angry at me for not searching hard enough, but you're the one who disappeared. You're the one who rejected the clinical trial that might have saved you. You're the one who decided pride mattered more than survival, and now our daughters are losing their mother because you couldn't bear to let anyone see you struggle." Gloria's eyes flashed with something dangerous, and when she spoke, her voice carried venom that had been building for years. "How dare you," she whispered. "How dare you stand in my hospital room after 15 years of absence and blame me for dying? I made every choice alone because you weren't there to help make them. I rejected treatment I couldn't afford because you'd already made it clear that my problems weren't yours to solve. I disappeared because you told me to handle it, and I handled it the only way I knew how, which was to build a life that didn't need you, so our daughters wouldn't spend their childhood feeling like mistakes their father tolerated instead of celebrated." "But they did feel like mistakes," Bert shot back, gesturing to Iris and Jade, who stood frozen witnessing their parents' first honest fight. "They felt like mistakes because you told them I wasn't ready to be a father, because you made excuses for my absence instead of telling them the truth that I rejected them before they were born. You protected me from their anger, carried the burden of my failure, taught them to blame circumstances instead of me. And now I have to build relationships with daughters who don't trust me, not because they know the truth, but because they've spent years wondering what was so wrong with them that their father didn't want to stick around." Gloria tried to respond but started coughing, her body's rebellion against sustained argument, reminding everyone that this rage was costing more than she could afford to spend. Iris moved to help her mother, but Gloria waved her away, determined to finish what she'd started, even if finishing killed her faster than the cancer. "You're right," she said when the coughing subsided. "I protected you when I should have let our daughters hate you properly. I made excuses when I should have told them you were a coward who ran. I taught them to blame circumstances instead of holding you accountable for choosing fear over love. And I did all of that because I loved you enough to protect your memory even while you were busy forgetting we existed. So yes, I failed too. I failed them by making your absence seem noble instead of just weak. I failed myself by carrying guilt that belonged to you. I failed everyone by being so determined to be strong that I forgot strength without vulnerability is just another word for slow suicide." The admission hung in the air between them, both of them finally stripped of protective lies and faced with the ugly truth of their mutual destruction. They'd both failed, catastrophically in different ways, both chosen wrong for different reasons, both built lives around the hole the other left, while pretending that hole could be filled with anything except the honesty neither of them had been brave enough to offer. "I don't know how to fix any of this," Bert said, and his voice cracked on words that felt like surrender. "I don't know how to be the father our daughters need when I don't even know how to live with myself. I don't know how to honor your memory when your memory includes all the ways I failed you. I don't know how to move forward when forward means living with consequences I created but can't undo." Gloria looked at him with eyes that held exhaustion deeper than physical tiredness, the kind of tired that came from years of carrying burdens that should have been shared. "You don't fix it," she said quietly. "You just live with it. You show up for our daughters every day even when showing up is hard. You tell them the truth about what happened between us without making excuses or painting yourself as tragic. You let them be angry at you. Let them question whether you'll stay. Let them test you until they're satisfied you've learned how to be brave enough not to run when things get complicated. And maybe eventually they'll trust you. Maybe eventually they'll forgive you the way I did, by accepting that you were human and scared and made terrible choices that don't erase your capability for eventual growth." She reached for Iris and Jade, pulled them close with what little strength remained. "I need you to promise me something," she said to her daughters. "Promise me you'll give your father a real chance. Not the performance of a chance while keeping him at arm's length emotionally, but an actual honest attempt at building a relationship that acknowledges he failed but doesn't let that failure define everything forever. Promise me you'll let him love you the way he should have loved you from the beginning, and that you'll love him back if he proves he's capable of being worthy of that love." "Mom, don't," Jade said through tears. "Don't make us promise to forgive him while you're dying. Don't use your death to manipulate us into accepting someone who rejected us." "I'm not manipulating you into forgiveness," Gloria said firmly. "I'm asking you to stay open to possibility instead of closing yourselves off from the chance at having a father, because I spent years teaching you that we didn't need him. You deserved a father who showed up. He failed to be that person, but he's here now and he's trying, and I need to know you'll give him the opportunity to prove he's learned how to be brave enough to stay, even when staying is hard." Bert watched this exchange with the understanding that Gloria was giving him a gift he didn't deserve, using her final moments to advocate for him instead of letting their daughter's justified anger be her lasting legacy. He wanted to protest, to tell her she didn't owe him this grace after everything, but she silenced him with a look that said this was her choice to make, and his job was just to accept it without diminishing her agency by pretending false nobility. "I promise," Iris said finally, and Jade nodded agreement even though neither of them looked entirely comfortable with the commitment. "We'll give him a real chance. But if he fails us the way he failed you, if he disappears or stops trying or decides redemption requires too much effort, then we reserve the right to cut him out permanently." "That's fair," Gloria said, and something in her expression finally softened into peace that looked different from resignation. "That's all anyone can ask for, the chance to prove they've learned from their failures, with the understanding that proof requires sustained effort instead of just good intentions." She closed her eyes, the conversation having depleted whatever reserves had allowed this final confrontation. Her breathing became more labored again, her body reminding everyone that anger and honesty cost energy she no longer had to spare. The medical team adjusted medications, managed symptoms, walked the careful line between comfort and hastening death that defined their impossible job. As Gloria drifted toward unconsciousness, Bert moved closer to her bedside one final time. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for forgiving me even though I didn't earn it. For giving me the chance with our daughters that I should have fought for from the beginning. For being strong enough to be honest about your anger instead of dying with it locked inside. For everything you gave me despite having every right to give nothing." Gloria's eyes opened briefly, focused on him with the last of her clarity. "Don't waste it," she whispered. "Don't waste the chance I'm giving you by being the same man who ran 15 years ago. Be better, be brave, be the father our daughters deserved from the moment they were born. That's how you honor my memory, not by mourning me, but by finally becoming the person you should have been all along." Those were the last words she spoke with full consciousness. She slipped away gradually over the next hours, her body completing the shutdown it had been attempting for days, her breathing becoming more shallow until it finally stopped altogether just before dawn, with her daughters holding her hands and Bert standing witness to the ending of everything that could have been but never was, because fear won too many battles that mattered. The silence after her final breath felt absolute, the machines no longer beeping because there was nothing left to monitor, just 4 people in a hospital room processing the reality that Gloria was gone, and whatever happened next would have to be built on the foundation of her absence, her forgiveness, and the complicated legacy of 2 people who loved each other but never learned how to be brave enough to make that love survive the complications that came with actually choosing each other.